Thank you so much for joining me. This is the Wisdom in Exile conference hosted by our partners, Tibet House, Embodied Philosophy, and Foundation for the Sacred Stream. And I'm so delighted to be a member or invitee to this amazing conference. And of course, Bob Thurman has been a longtime teacher for me, and the Tibet House has been one of my main homes of learning. And so it's a true pleasure to support both the Tibet House and the larger Tibetan cause, which is as many of the indigenous wisdom traditions on this planet, a near extinction, facing near extinction. And so any endeavor that we can participate in to preserve ancient wisdom cultures is an extremely important endeavor. And so I want to thank you for your commitment and your interest in making humanity, to save humanity and to usher in possibly a new paradigm. And I believe is what some of the intention behind this programming is. And again, I want to just say it's a huge honor for me to participate with such luminaries like Thupten Jinpa and Bob Thurman and many other unbelievable figures. Huge honor for me. So thank you very, very much. In preparing for this lecture, I had to really think about where we find ourselves in time and space, to really become sensitive about what kind of message I would like to broadcast or share with you. And being the young father of two children, Bodhi being 4 and Pema being 1.5, I often wake up in the middle of the night thinking, what kind of planet will they inherit? And I know I'm not alone in that concern. We are living in a time of tremendous ecological devastation, and we're living in a time where the economic disparity has never been greater. And of course, we are witnessing some of the most atrocious social burdens and social unrest. And at the same time, I also believe co-emergent with those crises is a tremendous burgeoning of desire to embrace consciousness and to embrace spirit. And in my thinking about why it is that is happening, these two systems or two paradigms are clashing, consciousness on the one hand and strife or crisis on the other. I have had to really examine some historical facts, and I've traced a little bit what I think might be the genesis of how we got here to a place in time where the ice caps are melting, where people still go hungry even though there's enough food to feed them, where a Greyhound bus full of executives own more than half the wealth on the planet. Something is gone awry. Something desperately wrong has happened. And no plan or solution for our future can be had without first really recognizing the inherent problem. And the best that I can do in my limited capacity is to trace the origin of the current crises to about 350 years ago in Western Europe during what is now called the Enlightenment or the Age of Reason. And prior to that time, the world was dominated by religiosity. At least the Western European world was dominated by the Catholic Church, for example. And that hierarchy and that power establishment had reigned supreme and had sort of dominated its people. And it was rife with political corruption, and it was championing awful crusades and killing people. And it was really subservience was really predicated on blind faith. And I think naturally and rightfully a movement began to emerge to swing that pendulum away from blind faith towards reason. And the unbelievable momentum shift of re-empowering the human mind to be critical and to be analytical and to look at reality strategically and systematically, and to get down to the business of what is observable and reducible, and out of the realm of the unseen and out of the realm of the metaphysic. And this provides the genesis for developments in technology and science and medicine. And over the centuries, we send a man to the moon, and we create the internet, and we rid the planet of unnecessary cancers and illnesses, and we raise the standard of living for the bottom portion of the population. And so there's no argument to the benefits of science. However, and unfortunately, if we look also realistically and we become honest, if we look closely at this paradigm of materialism that has replaced religion, upon which the scientific method is situated, that paradigm also carries with it what I call a sickness of paradigm. It has an inherent blind spot. If we look at the world in this completely reductionistic way and we reduce everything to matter, then what we do is actually diminish our own inherent value. And if we diminish our own inherent value, we cheapen the value of all other living beings. And we become called to dominate matter, which is what we've done with science. We can send a man to the moon, but we also have lost touch with nature and our role as a member of nature rather than as a domineering factor of nature. And if you look at the climate crisis and you look at the geopolitical crisis and you look at the economic crisis, what I see these as is symptoms of an amplification of the already pre-existing human defilements or afflictions that have always been there since the dawn of humanity. I'm not arguing that greed and hatred and violence and prejudice are new phenomenon in the modern contemporary world. What I'm suggesting is that neoliberal capitalism and scientific reductionism and materialism and hedonism have all amplified the embers of human affliction. So much so that we have these vast disparities, and we have this social unrest, and we have conquest, and in unprecedented numbers. And in my work as a psychotherapist, clocking thousands and thousands of hours with people, I have heard the story of their plight, of being what I'm now calling the inhabitant of a cinder block world, living in a concrete world as an automaton. I mean, especially in New York City, where we can live in such small quarters and yet be so alienated from each other. And what do? We wake up every day thinking, I'm this body only with a short, limited time span. And I trudge myself through the subway where I'm being assaulted by other living beings who are merely in my way, taking up a narrow amount of space. And I get to my job, which is really dissatisfying because what I really am is just a widget maker on an assembly line. And I'm trying to carve out enough resource so I can have a nice time buying a latte or a small trip vacation or something like that. But really, in the grand scheme of things, it's empty and purposeless. And I think people naturally feel anguish and despair and hopelessness and dissatisfaction. And then, of course, our Western medical industrialized complex comes in and treats people like that by pumping them full of medicine, in the same way that we pump our environment full of toxins and pesticides. And so something is awry in our thinking. Something has gone wrong in our worldview that is driving us to live in this way. And I have a good buddy, Phil, if you don't mind me digressing, who's doing a wonderful documentary with the Lakota people. He was there filming during the time of Standing Rock. And after all the cameras left and the media attention left, he was invited in by some sacred elders into ceremony, sacred ceremony. And there was one video clip that I remember him getting that really stuck in my mind and made a huge impression. A young elder of the tradition told Phil, your way of life, and he was pointing to Phil, who was American-born, Western way of life, the Western mentality, the scientific paradigm of materialism and reductionism that are rooted essentially in nihilism, the opposite of religion, nihilism. That way of life has a shelf life of 300 or 400 years. In other words, living in an economic paradigm, for example, of infinite growth with finite resources is an unavoidable catastrophe waiting to happen. And we see it around us. The economic collapse of 2008 is but a moment on the Richter scale of many more seismic earthquakes to come. Because the way we've been living on this planet is not sustainable. And it's not sustainable because we never forecasted in advance the problems of living on this planet in the way driven by this nihilistic, reductionistic paradigm. So for all the advances we have made, we are now paying the price. And this Native American elder, this First Nations elder said, your way of life has a shelf life of 300-400 years maximum. But our way of life, we could live indefinitely in harmony with the earth. And what I love and am so struck by that is that way of life, because of imperialism and colonialism and domination and more of the same, that way of life is now endangered, greatly, greatly endangered. Another friend of mine in Canada, Marco, who's also a very devoted student of the First Nations tradition, told me one day in a late night conversation that at one time the elders of a particular tribe or tradition were so few in number that if they took a ride in one person's car to get from point A to point B and had an accident, in that accident, if it was fatal, the last living members of a wisdom-holding tradition would all die out in a single moment, and that would be it. And we are now seeing the precipice of the mass extinction of multiple species and plant life, but also sacred wisdom cultures that hold within them the promise of a vision, of restoring a vision that is far more sustainable for us as human beings to live on a planet as we approach 8 billion people with the ice caps melting. Something dramatic needs to happen, and we are currently in a co-arising or co-emergence of crisis and awareness happening together. And that awareness could lead us to reconnect with spirit by way of the wisdom traditions of ancient cultures. Whether it be the Lakota or the First Nations cultures, whether it be the plant medicine keepers of the shamans of the Amazon, whether it be the indigenous tribes of India or the yoga traditions of India, or in my case, I have devoted 20 years of my life to the Tibetan culture. That also was on the cusp of a genocide, and if it were not for the Indians that invited them to inhabit to provide refuge and refugee status for the Tibetans in exile, may have been lost. And because of that moment of generosity by the Indian government to receive the Tibetans for settlements, the opportunity to preserve the culture was moved forward. But it is always just moving forward enough to be lingering tenuously on the precipice of extinction. And so I think conferences like this and the champion that the Dalai Lama is as he teaches across the planet is reminding people of the unique opportunity to embrace not a religion, but a way of seeing reality that is far more sustainable and beneficial and egalitarian for all humanity at this critical time. And so this is the backdrop that I am then receiving the invitation from Embodied Philosophy to provide a lecture for you. And what I heard in their request was, what is the one thing from the Tibetan tradition that you could teach somebody else to preserve as a kind of seed for future fruition. And if I could just choose one teaching from the vast plethora of the Tibetan tradition, I thought to myself, because the Tibetan tradition is so vast and so sophisticated and so elegant and so complex and so beautiful, what's the one thing that I'd like to teach on? If I could almost put a seed in a pot for a future generation, an experiment, a time capsule. And it became clear to me that one of the most unique contributions that I don't think is as well articulated in any other wisdom tradition is this notion of bodhicitta. Bodhichitta, literally the awakened mind. And what bodhicitta is a human being's recognition of their infinite potential. And it is the warm heart that expresses itself as an aspiration, as a resolve, a vow, a pledge to maximize human potential in order to be of infinite benefit for the planet. And as we ride the cusp here in seismic waves of possible or potential destruction, I can't imagine a more pressing solution than to embrace this vision of one's human potential, embracing one's human potential, not just for oneself, but for the benefit of all of us on this planet. Imagine those beautiful photographs from space when we first sent a man to the moon, of the image of the planet floating in outer space, the first time human beings were able to see themselves objectively in the vast open cosmos. Just how infinitely small we are, and yet how precious, how majestic, how unfathomable, how uncalculable it is to have life in the vast potentialities and the delicate balance, all the causes and conditions coming together to support life on this microscopic planet, just close enough and far enough from the sun in the whole, and what we're learning about the cosmos and how many other planets and how many other solar systems. It is ineffable, undescribable, how precious human life is. And so bodhicitta is a recognition of our precious life. It is a recognition of our incredible potential, and it is a recognition of our universal commitment to other living beings. And I thought to myself, if I had one chance to articulate it and then deliver for you a way to cultivate it, then perhaps that might be a good hour spent. And I hope that you agree.